First of all, before I get too deep into this, I want to recognize Wisconsin Farmers Union. You know, they came to me about 4 or 5 months ago and did a very nice job courting us to get engaged in this workshop again, which we wanted to do. And I particularly want to point out David Wright-Brissett. David's in the front. David, stand up. David did a very nice job. He did the lion's share of the work putting this together. Let's give David I have been out of town a lot, and it was nice to have David just email me and say, this is taken care of, this is taken care of. It's very nice. For those of you that have been following the legislature, you know that it has been a very busy legislative session today, and in fact, the last 2 weeks have been extraordinarily busy. I was in Arizona for our national meeting, like I said, last week, and I tried to take 1 day off to hike the Grand Canyon, which I did. But amazingly, unlike parts of northern Wisconsin, you get great cell phone reception right in the middle of the Grand Canyon. So I was doing just as much work as I was doing. Seriously, you do. I was doing just as much work as I was doing hiking. And that's because the last 2 weeks, Paul Kent, who's going to be talking right after me, he and I were on the phone the other day, he says, boy, it just seems like it's been raining legislation. And I got to tell you, it has been raining like it has been the last 2 days in Wisconsin legislation. And I would just make one little tweak to what Paul said. For us, some of that legislation I would characterize as a storm. It's been storming legislation. There's one piece of legislation in particular, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk to it later today, that does impact frac sand mining that we're very, very concerned about, in fact. So there are some proposals that we find disfavor with. And my time has been very much involved in Madison and Washington and trying to keep ahead of this stuff. And for those of you that are from towns, how many of you are from towns, by the way? Raise your hands. Got about half the room, and the rest from Farmers Union. I think about a 50-50 split. For those of you from the towns, you know we went into legislative session a little short-handed, and we're a little more short-handed a couple of weeks ago as a result of some things that went on as well. So we're really relying on me and one other person to do what used to be 4 people's jobs. So my ability to actually prepare for today was really muted. And finally, thank God, on my flight back from Arizona, I was able to start to put pen to paper, figure out what I was going to talk about today. And I went to the agenda and I went to the notes that I was keeping during our discussions developing this. And in the agenda it says, we're going to have you walk out of here today with an increased understanding of some of the emerging issues. And David and the crew has put together a phenomenal agenda. And a little bit later on it says what I'm going to talk about. And I'm up here to talk about the general role of local government. What is the role of local government? And we're not going to get into the tactical right now. Paul Kent after me, and really a number of others after me that are on the agenda today are going to get into the tactical. I'm going to cover this from a very 30,000-foot overview. And when I came to that recognition on the flight, I started to think, well, how can I introduce this role of local government? And I immediately thought of a couple of people that I had just been reading about. I used to do a lot of leisurely reading, and for me, leisurely is history and leadership, nonfiction. I don't get into any of these romance stories or anything like that. My wife does, and the covers are interesting sometimes, but I don't get into reading that stuff. So I had read a little bit ago about some Roman Empire material, and one of the characters in the Roman Empire that some of you probably heard about is a Roman emperor named Caligula. Okay? Caligula was Roman emperor from AD 37 to AD 41. Started out on very good terms, by the way. People loved him. He was to be co-emperor, actually, and they decided, the power structure decided, yeah, we probably don't want 2 people. And a number of people lobbied to have Caligula be the emperor, and he won out. Now Caligula immediately, almost immediately, really became coerced by absolute power. When you're emperor, you have absolute power. You can dictate things. He became coerced by that and became very egotistical, prideful, full of hubris, bloodthirsty, and eventually the same people that really lobbied on his behalf so that he could be individual emperor versus co-emperor, they were the ones that quite literally put the knife in his chest. They assassinated him in the streets of Rome. Now, Caligula is only 60, 70, 68 years actually into emperor rule in Rome. For centuries, actually, Rome was a republic, a representative democracy. And upon his death, a number of people are saying, hey, we want to return to having the Senate in control, a representative democracy. But there were some served very well by having a dictator that used their power and influence to have Claudius become emperor. This is Caligula's uncle. Claudius really didn't want it, but he took it anyway, because after all, you're in control by yourself. It's sort of a power trip, right? It's pretty cool. So he took it. And we know where Rome ends up. Now, another person I had been reading about lately, and I hadn't picked up anything on George Washington in 4 or 5 years, but I read just a little bit of material about George Washington. We all know George Washington, of course. Very different than Caligula. Unassuming, very reserved, quiet, very rarely talked. Wanted to lead, but wanted to lead from behind. And his true love actually wasn't being in the military or being in any sort of leadership position in the public sector. He wanted to be a farmer. In fact, when he went into the British Army, he was only there initially for a very short period of time, and retired or quit the British Army in 1758 to become a farmer. He inherited Mount Vernon in 1761, and he was very happy to stay there. But this little skirmish with the French occurred, and he took part in the French and Indian War. Did very well, wanted to retire again, but because of the principles that he really held strongly in his value system, he decided to be a leader in the Revolutionary War, and we all know where that ends up. He's the hero, he's the person that really turns it around for us. He gets Cornwallis to surrender, and in the end, people offer him the kingship. Much like Claudius, he gets offered empire rule, dictator type rule. And unlike Claudius, he decides, no, that's not why we just got done fighting this war. We want local control. We want decentralized government. We want a republic, a representative democracy. And that's the type of government that eventually gets formed. We go through the articles and eventually to the Constitution, and we have in the United States a republic that is built upon local, decentralized control. There was a colonial visitor to North America in the mid-1700s, while we were still colonies, that went back to Britain and wrote about the uniquenesses of each of these 13 colonies, and a quote that he had really sticks out to me. He said, fire and water are not more heterogeneous than the different colonies of North America. And what he was recognizing there is that Georgia is very different than Florida. Delaware is black, Rhode Island is white. North Carolina and South Carolina, although they are both Carolinas and share a border, are so very different. And the system of government that was created by our forefathers recognized that. Through a small R republic, a representative democracy, we have local, decentralized government. And that's why Rome ended up the way that it did and why we are the way we are right now. Now, some would argue that our democracy might be a little sick, and it has been at times before, but we have in place the opportunities and the systems to fix anything that does become sick. So we have a very unique decentralized system, and we all inherited that system. And we need to be stewards of that system. We have the responsibility to uphold that decentralized system of local control. And when issues come up, what I have found in my short time, I've been executive director about a year and a half now, a little under a year and a half. What I have found is that towns and local governments in general tend to respond to issues and opportunities, just like we have the frac sand issue and opportunity, in a bell-shaped curve. Okay? We have a vast majority that respond very similarly in the middle, and then we have those that respond at different ends of the spectrum. And one of those ends of the spectrum we characterized in any issue or opportunity that we end up addressing is laissez-faire. We aren't going to do much. This issue comes up, that issue comes up, be it frac sand or high cap wells or you name it, we just aren't going to do much. Now that laissez-faire by choice is something that was by design of the forefathers. If you don't want to do much, you don't have to. And that's what we like as a towns association. There is also laissez-faire by demand, by dictate, by a Caligula-like centralized government. That's what we don't like. Those two laissez-faire responses are very different. They both exist, they're very different. We also have at the other end of the spectrum an overly aggressive approach to managing a situation, oftentimes overly aggressive from a regulatory standpoint. Now that can be by choice, again, something that is by design that we like to see, or that can be dictated to us. And you all are familiar with some of the examples that populate both ends of the spectrum. Oftentimes, one end of the spectrum gets dictated to us because we chose the other end of the spectrum. For example, there were a minority of towns that chose a very aggressive approach to livestock sighting. 10 years ago, about 10 years ago, the control by local government of livestock sighting was taken away. They swing to the other side of the spectrum. We have the same situation with wind sighting. On the other side of the story, we weren't doing much with culverts. And it was dictated to us that we had to manage culverts in a more aggressive regulatory manner. So what I have found in the short time that I've been with the Towns Association is that management by choice at one end of the spectrum, depending upon where you're at politically in Madison or Washington, usually results in an unequal response that causes us to be at the other end of the spectrum. Neither is good for local government. If we're going to be responsible stewards of local control, acting at either end of the spectrum causes some challenges. So in answering the question, what is the role of local government, I would argue that the role of local government is to certainly uphold the traditions of local control by trying to figure out a balance somewhere in the middle that prevents us from swinging back and forth at either end of the spectrum. Now, I'm not going to try to tell you what I think the balance is. Quite frankly, I don't have an opinion on what that balance is. But you all do. And what I'd like to leave you with here today, and really have it be a platform for thinking through this issue throughout the rest of the day, are some questions. You know, how do we, and here's one of them, how do we live in the middle of that bell curve and develop the town's economy? One of the roles of a town government is to help develop the town's economy. And there are a number of ways to do that. Agriculture, mining, tourism, industry, retail. Depending upon which town you're in Wisconsin, there are a variety of different opportunities to develop the economy. Okay? Mining has, as was noted by Tom, some positives and some potential negatives as well. So how do you balance that? How are you a responsible steward of that local control that we've been handed down to us, and still develop the economy? How do we live in the middle of that bell curve? How do we balance it out and grow our culture, grow our society, protect our society from certain negatives that can happen when we do certain things on the landscape? How do we take advantage of certain positive things that can happen on the landscape? How do we live in the middle of that bell curve and wisely use natural resources? In the tradition of Teddy Roosevelt, in the tradition of Gifford Pinchot, how do we wisely use the resources that we've been provided? What is the balance there? How do we live in the middle of the bell curve and provide for a quality transportation system? Now, if you peel back the onion a little bit, mining, non-metallic mining, has a lot to do with our ability to develop a quality transportation system. How do you operate within a town to balance out the different ends of the spectrum, the different approaches, so that we have a quality transportation system? And then the last one I'll provide you is, how do we make decisions that protect or grow our Republican, small r, democratic form of government? What we know, and you've seen it, you'll continue to see it, is that approaches at far ends of the spectrum cause unequal responses at the other end of the spectrum. So how do we balance off our approaches so that that Republican, Democratic form of government that we've been handed down to us is still something that we have available to us now and for future generations? Big question, but questions that need to be answered on this issue and a lot of other issues that we have in front of us as a Towns Association and as a farmers union. My watch ended up in the middle of a deer gut pile sometime in November, but I'm getting to be a Gen Xer here. I'm not wearing a watch. I haven't since November. And it tells me here we are about right on time. So we are due for about a 15-minute break. I encourage you to begin the dialogue that hopefully I've spurred with those questions during break. I'm back at 10:30 and we'll get into the very tactical with Paul. Thank you.